The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Countess Gertrude. Long after the drop of lake water had fallen from the ilex leaf and the myriad reflections that had floated on its surface had become a part of the ABACTINA of what had gone forever, the head at the thorn-prick window had remained gazing out into the summer. It belonged to the Countess. She was standing on a ladder, for only in such a way could she obtain a view through that high, ivy-cluttered opening. Behind her the shadowy room was full of birds. Blobs of flame on the dark crimson wallpaper smouldered, for a few sunbeams shredded their way past her head and struck the wall with silent violence. They were entirely motionless in the half-light and burned without a flicker, forcing the rest of the room into still deeper shade and into a kind of subjugated motion, a counterplay of volumes of many shades between the hues of deep ash-grey and black. It was difficult to see the birds, for there were no candles lighted. The summer burned beyond the small high window. At last the Countess descended the ladder, step after mammoth step, until both feet on the ground she turned about and began to move to the shadowy bed. When she reached its head, she ignited the wick of a half-melted candle and, seating herself at the base of the pillows, emitted a peculiarly sweet, low, whistling note from between her great lips. For all her bulk it was as though she had, from a great winter tree, become a summer one. Not with leaves was she decked, but, thick as foliage, with birds. Their 100 eyes twinkled like glass beads in the candlelight. "Listen," she said. "We're alone. Things are bad. Things are going wrong. There's evil afoot. I know it." Her eyes narrowed. "But let 'em try. We can bide our time. We'll hold our horses. Let them rear their ugly hands, and by the doom we'll crack 'em chine-ways. Within 4 days the earling, and then I'll take 'em, babe and boy, Titus the 77th. She rose to her feet. "God shrive my soul, for it'll need it," she boomed, as the wings fluttered about her and the little claws shifted for balance. "God shrive it when I find the evil thing. For absolution or no absolution, there'll be satisfaction found." She gathered some cake crumbs from a nearby crate and placed them between her lips. At the trotting sound of her tongue, a warbler pecked from her mouth, but her eyes had remained half-closed, and what could be seen of her iris was as hard and glittering as a wet flint. "Satisfaction," she repeated huskily, with something purr-like in the heavy-sounding syllables. "In Titus it's all centred. Stone and mountain. The blood and the observance. Let them touch him. For every hair that's hurt, I'll stop a heart. If grace I have when turbulence is over, so be it. And if not, what then?" The Apparition. Something in a white shroud was moving towards the door of the twins' apartment. The castle was asleep. The silence like space. The thing was inhumanly tall and appeared to have no arms. In their room, the aunts sat holding each other by the empty grate. They had been waiting so long for the handle of the door to turn. This is now what it began to do. The twins had their eyes on it. They had been watching it for over an hour, the room ill lit. their brass clock ticking. And then, suddenly, through the gradually yawning fissure of the door, the thing entered, its head scraping the lintel. Its head, grinning and frozen, was the head of a skull. They could not scream. The twins could not scream. Their throats were contracted. Their limbs had stiffened. The bulging of their 4 identical eyes was ghastly to see, and as they stood there, paralyzed, a voice from just below the grinning skull cried, "Terror! Terror! Terror! Pure, naked, and bloody!" And the 9-foot length of sheet moved into the room. Old Sourdust's skull had come in useful. Balanced on the end of the sword-stick and dusted with phosphorus, the sheet hanging vertically down its either side and kept in place by a tack through the top of the cranium, Steerpike was able to hold it 3 feet above his own head and peer through a slit he had made in the sheet at his eye level. The white linen fell in long, sculptural folds to the floor of the room. The twins were the colour of the sheet. Their mouths were wide open, and their screams tore inward at their bowels for lack of natural vent. They had become congealed with an icy horror. Their hair, disentangling from knot and coil, had risen like pampas grass that lifts in a dark light when gusts prowl shuddering and presage storm. They could not even cling more closely together, for their limbs were weighted with cold stone. It was the end. The thing scraped the ceiling with its head and moved forward noiselessly in one piece. Having no human possibility of height, it had no height. It was not a tall ghost. It was immeasurable, death walking like an element. Steerpike had realized that unless something was done, it would be only a matter of time before the twins, through the loose meshwork of their vacant brains, divulged the secret of the burning. However much they were in his power, he could not feel sure that the obedience which had become automatic in his presence would necessarily hold when they were among others. As he now saw it, it seemed that he had been at the mercy of their tongues ever since the fire, and he could only feel relief that he had escaped detection. For until now he had had hopes that, vacuous as they were, they would be able to understand the peril in which, were any suspicion to be attached to them, they would stand. But he now realized that through terrorism and victimization alone could loose lips be sealed. And so he had lain awake and planned a little episode. Phosphorus, which along with the poisons he had concocted in Prunesquall's dispensary, and which as yet he had found no use for. His sword-stick, as yet unsheathed, save when alone he polished the slim blade, and a sheet. These were his media for the concoction of a walking death. And now he was in their room. He could watch them perfectly through the slit in the sheet. If he did not speak now, before the hysterics began, then they would hear nothing, let alone grasp its meaning. He lifted his voice to a weird and horrible pitch. "I am death," he cried. "I am all who have died. I am the death of twins. Behold, look at my face. It is naked. It is bone. It is revenge. Listen, I am the one who strangles." He took a further pace towards them. Their mouths were still open and their throats strained to loose the clawing cry. "I come as warning, warning. Your throats are long and white and ripe for strangling. My bony hands can squeeze all breath away. I come as warning. Listen." There was no alternative for them. They had no power. I am Death, and I will talk to you, the burners. Upon that night you lit a crimson fire. You burned your brother's heart away. Oh, horror! Steerpike drew breath. The eyes of the twins were well nigh upon their cheekbones. He must speak very simply. But there is yet a still more bloody crime. The crime of speech. The crime of mentioning. For this I murder in a darkened room. I shall be watching. Each time you move your mouths, I shall be watching. Watching with my enormous eyes of bone. I shall be listening with my fleshless ears, and my long fingers will be itching. Not even to each other shall you speak. Not of your crime, oh horror! Not of the crimson fire. Oh, my cold grave calls me back, but shall I answer it? No, for I shall be beside you forever, listening, with my fingers itching. You will not see me, but I shall be here, there, and wherever you go, forevermore. Speak not of fire, or Steerpike. Fire, or Steerpike, your protector, for the sake of your long throats, your long white throats. Steerpike turned majestically. The skull had tilted a little on the point of the swordstick, but it did not matter. The twins were ice-bound in an Arctic sea. As he moved solemnly through the doorway, something grotesque, terrifying, ludicrous in the slanting angle of the skull, as though it were listening, gave emphasis to all that had gone before. As soon as he had closed the door behind him, he shed himself of the sheet, and, wrapping the skull in its folds, hid it from view among some lumber that lay along the wall of the passage. There was still no sound from the room. He knew that it would be fruitless to appear the same evening. Whatever he said would be lost. He waited a few moments, however, expecting the hysteria to find a voice, but at length began his return journey. As he turned the corner of a distant passageway, he suddenly stopped dead. It had begun. Dulled as it was by the distance and the closed doors, it was yet horrifying enough, the remote, flat, endless screaming of naked panic. When on the evening of the next day he visited them, he found them in bed. The old woman who smelt so badly had brought them their meals. They lay close together and were obviously very ill. They were so white that it was difficult to tell where their faces ended and the long pillow began. The room was brightly lit. Steerpike was glad to notice this. He remembered that, as Death, he had mentioned his preference for strangling in a darkened room. The strong lights indicated that the twins were able to remember at least a part of what he had said that night. But even now he was taking no chances. "Your ladyships," he said, "you look seedy, very seedy. But believe me, you don't look as bad as I feel. I have come for your advice and perhaps for your help. I must tell you, be prepared." He coughed. "I have had a visitor from beyond. Do not be startled, ladies, but his name was Death. He came to me and he said, Their ladyships have done foul murder. I shall go to them now and squeeze the breath from their old bodies. But I said no. Hold back, I pray you, for they have promised never to divulge a word. And Death said, How can I be sure? How can I have proof? I answered, I am your witness. If their ladyships so much as mention the word fire or Steerpike, you shall take them with you under wormy ground. Cora and Clarice were trying to speak, but they were very weak. At last Cora said, He came here too. He's still here. Oh, save us! Save us! He came here? Said Steerpike, jumping to his feet. Death came here too? Yes. How strange that you are still alive. Did he give you orders? Yes, said Clarice. And you remember them all? Yes, yes, said Cora, fingering her throat. We can remember everything. Oh, save us! It is for you to save yourself with silence. You wish to live? They nodded pathetically. Then never a word. Never a word, echoed Clarice in the hush of the bright room. Steerpike bowed and retired, and returned by an alternative staircase flanked by a long, steep curve of banister, down which he slid at high speed, landing nimbly at the foot of the stairs with a kind of pounce. He had commandeered a fresh suite of rooms whose windows gave upon the cedar lawns. It was more in keeping with the position which his present duties commanded. Glancing along the corridor before he entered his apartments, he could see in the distance, too far for the sound of their footsteps, the figures of Fuchsia and the Doctor. He entered his room. The window was a smoke-blue rectangle intersected by black branches. He lit a lamp. The walls flared, and the window became black. The branches had disappeared. He drew the blinds. He kicked off his shoes and, springing on the bed, twisted himself onto his back and, for a moment, discarded his dignity and became, at least physically, a little more in keeping with his 17 years, for he wriggled, arched his spine, and stretched out his arms and legs with a terrible glee. Then he began to laugh and laugh, the tears pouring from his dark red eyes, until, utterly exhausted and helpless, he fell back upon the pillows and slept, his thin lips twisted. An hour earlier, Fuchsia had met the Doctor at their rendezvous, the cool room. He had not been flippant. He had helped her with words well chosen and thoughts simple and direct that touched deftly on the areas of her sorrow. Together they had covered, in their conversation, the whole range of lamentable and melancholy experiences which it had been their lot to encounter. They had spoken of all connected with them, of Fuchsia's brooding mother, of the uncanny disappearance of her father, and whether he was dead or alive, of the Doctor's sister and of the twins, of the enigma of Swelter and Flay, and of little Nanny Slag, of Barquentine and of Steerpike. "Be careful of him, Fuchsia," said the Doctor. "Will you remember that?" "I will," said Fuchsia. "Yes, I will, Dr. Prune." Dusk was beyond the bay window, a great crumbling dusk that wavered and descended like a fog of ashes. Fuchsia unfastened the 2 top buttons of her blouse and folded the corners back. She had turned away from the Doctor as she did so. Then she held her hands cupped over her breastbone. It seemed as though she were hiding something. "Yes, I will be careful, Dr. Prune," she repeated, "and I'll remember all you have said. And tonight I had to wear it. I had to." "You had to wear what, my little mushroom?" said Prunesquall, lightening his voice for the first time, for the serious session was over and they could relax. "Bless my dull wits if I haven't lost the thread, if there was one. Say it again, my swarthy sweet." "Look, look!" For you and for me, because I wanted to." She dropped her hands to her side, where they hung heavily. Her eyes shone. She was a mixture of the clumsy and the magnificent. Her head bridled up, her throat gleaming, her feet apart and the toes turned in a little. "Look!" The doctor at her command looked very hard indeed. The ruby she had given her that night, when for the first time she had met Steerpike, burned against her breast. And then, suddenly, unexpectedly, she had fled, her feet pounding on the stone floors, while the door of the cool room swung to and fro, to and fro.